Right. Welcome back to the last lecture. This is the last it. This is it. This is the last one. So let's do it. We're picking off where we ended kind of abruptly last time. Um, and we're talking about futuristic tech. So yeah, let's talk about some examples of future tech that is currently kind of in vogue. AI. Let's talk about AI. In the realm of these handful of really important aspects of very powerful things that are kind of like in the zeitgeist right now, right? Ecological concerns are something that we're taking. It's hard not to take very, very seriously because we're in this moment of escalating global climate crisis. And because a lot of this tech has extremely significant ecological, military, and sociopolitical effects as well. So, like, hand in hand with the ecological concerns here, we've got military concerns, right? The uses of this tech in a military context, and then also sociopolitical effects of this tech. So we're going to talk about these three aspects of each of these pieces of technology. So when it comes to AI, right, we've got water usage being a concern, pollution. It leads to cancer alleys, which is the term for when a lot of people in an area get cancer, like more than you'd expect. Extreme energy costs, extreme generation of heat. All of this is pretty bad for the environment. And then also you have to clear large areas of land for data centers. Um, Military uses of AI are pretty massive, right? Technology is used in algorithms that are used to identify targets for military strikes. We've got autonomous drone warfare, in conjunction with the surveillance infrastructure that we're discussing, the data of which is often fed to AI and also parsed by AI. It's both used to train AI, and also AI is interpreting the surveillance data and influencing who is getting targeted. Um, and then sociopolitically, AI is really significant because it spreads a lot of misinformation. It encourages the development of echo chambers by kind of responding to you with what it thinks you want to hear so that you keep talking to it. And then this endless flood of information as well makes it a lot harder to find info or research that's actually accurate. It makes it easy to produce propaganda campaigns, to distort reality, to call into question things that have commonly been accepted as true, and also to spread misinformation under the guise of presenting the truth. It becomes sort of like a very difficult to navigate and confusing informational landscape, and that gives a lot of power sociopolitically. Um, Peter Thiel is kind of like one of the faces of this in a lot of ways because Palantir, his big company, is extremely, extremely militarized, and is also very much caught up in um, surveillance tech for um, for policing and military uses. And so these are this is sort of a commentary on Peter Thiel and the Pope in this one article about the Pope's anti-AI encyclical and whether or not he's speaking directly to Peter Thiel when he references Gandalf. I thought this was important to talk about, both because it has some interesting resonances with what we talked about last week, with Columbus's rhetoric regarding apocalypse and the second coming of Christ, and this like end days accelerationism. Um, Only here, the end times for humanity involve transcendence through technology, rather than transcendence through colonialism. Uh, and that, but we've got this like military AI as a messianic figure opposed to the threat of an antichrist that Thiel calls stagnant and also refers to as being into peace and safetyism. So military is good here, and peace is a threat to humanity. Um, and so Peter Thiel's idea of the future, as presented in this quote that the article shares, which is from a podcast interview he did last year, um, his view of the future is very clear that like either the future is stagnant or the future is very, very military and dystopian. Um, so the quote is really interesting. Still think we should be trying AI, and that the alternative is total stagnation. So yeah, there's all sorts of interesting things that can happen with maybe drones in a military context are combined with AI, and okay, that is scary or dangerous or dystopian, or it's going to change things. But if you don't have AI, wow, there's just nothing going on. So yeah, he only really envisions one future for us, and that's pretty significant when he's one of the most powerful, like wealthy AI men out there. I don't know what the word for that is, but you know what I'm saying. Like this guy has a lot of power, and this is his vision of the future for us. So continuing with a little bit more from that 404 Media article on Facebook AI slop, dead internet theory is the theory that the internet is dead as in devoid of human life. It's all bots talking to other bots. This is a theory, right? The article here argues, though, instead that the internet is more complicated and more nuanced than that, and it's also more dangerous than that because it's not actually fully dead. There's a lot of people still there, but there are quite a lot of bots, and there are algorithms that are very interested in feeding the people who are still there bot content. So people get caught up in this nightmare where a lot of, if not most of, what they're being fed is AI, or sometimes accounts that are a little bit human and a little bit AI generated. And you get this bizarre split where you get some really realistic seeming content that can be very hard to parse whether or not it's real or AI generated. And you also get these extremely bizarre AI images that nobody would be fooled by. Um, but and people are spreading the first by being tricked into thinking that it's real, whereas the second is very obviously not real, but keeps being fed by bots that recognize that as the kind of thing that they're supposed to respond to. And in both cases, you get a lot of activity around an AI generated piece of media. So Facebook's algorithm rewards it. So you get a feed that's inundated with AI generated images, whether or not they're realistic or completely bizarre, strange shrimp Jesus stuff. Um, there are people involved in this though. So the internet's not dead. There's people caught up in the zombie internet on the side of they are being tricked by these images or not, but they are experiencing these images, being inundated by these images. And there's also people making the bots, right? Because the bots aren't just like appearing to make money off of the spam. Um, why does this happen on Facebook? Company makes money off of interactions, and human to human connection is not necessarily the most efficient or most profitable way to maximize engagement. This is why AI slop is so prevalent across a lot of platforms. Important takeaways from this article. One that Facebook isn't really a social network anymore because it's not about people socializing or networking. It's about interacting with visual content primarily that is often AI generated. That's kind of one of the big takeaways from this article. And another one is that this starts to poison not just social media, but also our understanding of what it is to be real, what is real, and assuming that other people that we're seeing are real. And so the author gives a lot of examples of people believing things that are definitely not AI to be AI generated and therefore doubting like people's reality and existence and their work. And also recognizing things and thinking that they're real when they are AI. So in both cases, our ability to parse what's real from not real becomes increasingly uh, dysregulated. So moving on to surveillance tech. Again, this has a lot of ecological devastating ecological impact that has a lot to do with pollution. It also has a lot to do with mining, right? Because all of this technology requires rare earth materials that are hard to find, and also the process of finding them is often highly militarily because a lot of in a lot of tech relies on cobalt, which is mined by enslaved miners in the Congo, and a genocide is currently being carried out in Congo. Um, so it's really hard to develop any tech that relies on any kind of cobalt without your tech relying on and continuing to fund this genocide. Um, Also, the tech is used in military contexts, right? Tracking and identifying targets, surveilling people that are perceived as threats. Um, and this bleeds into the sociopolitical, right? Surveillance tech is being used to explicitly police and target certain kinds of people's autonomy, right? We've got thought cameras being used to investigate people for allegedly crossing state borders to seek abortion care. We've got surveillance data being used to criminalize people like the Prairiland defendants. I'm going to plug in my computer because it's that time. Just like always, we have that computer threat. Moving on. General, how often do you worry about being surveilled? Whoops. That's a rhetorical question because you can't answer because this is recorded. Um, but there's a lot of types of surveillance that we do need to worry about in our day-to-day lives because they're kind of all over. Facial recognition software. Some grocery stores are deploying this now in changing how much they charge people. This is something Kroger has talked about. Identifying and building profiles on shoppers so that they can price things differently depending on you and what they think they can get away with charging you. Biomarker collection is another one. Face scans for opening phones, thumbprint scans for opening phones, ALPRs, automatic license plate readers. They track license plates and where they are in time and space. So, if you go to work at the same time via the same route every Tuesday, the cops know because they can see if you're driving, because they can see your car. They also might know if they're using a new piece of technology called Signal Trace, which is used to track and identify Bluetooth, which I talked about earlier. Online communications are monitored, age verification on platforms and websites. And there's a lot of surveillance justification through states of exception, which we talked about in previous weeks, right? This rhetoric of states of exception that your rights, say your right to privacy, ends at the ends where the state says it does because national security trumps privacy concerns. And so there's a lot of specific examples of this throughout time. The Patriot Act, COINTELPRO, and then today's version of that is NSPM 7, which we talked about a little bit. This is that new federal directive that frames, among other things, anti-fascist political views as a form of domestic terrorism. From whitehouse.gov, we've got this quote. There are common recurrent motivations and indicia uniting this pattern of violent and terroristic activities under the umbrella of self-described anti-fascism. These movements portray foundational American principles, e.g. support for law enforcement and border control, as fascist to justify and encourage acts of violent revolution. This anti-fascist lie has become the organizing rallying cry used by domestic terrorists to wage a violent assault against domestic institutions, constitutional rights, and fundamental American liberties. Common threads animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views. And this kind of, this is just one quote from a fairly long mandate. but it's pretty significant, because as you can kind of see in this text, there's a little bit of slippage here between what it means to be a terrorist because you do violence, like an actual act of violence, versus what it means to be labeled a terrorist because you participate in something that is considered a common thread that might animate that kind of violence. Like, is it enough to meet this definition of terrorism if you hold beliefs recognized as anti-capitalist, anti-American, or anti-Christian? And yeah, this kind of policy opens the door for surveilling people's media consumption and conversations for these common threads. It opens the door for surveillance of the content of your beliefs, regardless of your action. And that's pretty classic surveillance. Flock cameras are a specific example of surveillance tech that you probably see a lot of the time, whether or not you're thinking about it or not. They're kind of all over the place. There are a lot fewer here in Bloomington than there were even a couple months ago. This is because of a massive public outcry and a lot of community work to get rid of them. So if you look at back issues of the Herald Times, you'll see quite a lot of coverage of the community's fight to get Flock out of town. And so there are about half as many Flock cameras in Bloomington as there were a couple months ago, but there were still a lot left, mostly near the hospital and on the west side. There's some on 10th Street, 17th, and there's one on the streetlight on Kirkwood by the library. Flock cameras, for those of you who don't know what they are cameras that there's a bunch of different forms of them. The most famous form is the license plate reader, but they also do have other forms of cameras as well. And they are always on, always recording. Ostensibly, they're there to collect license plate and car information. Realistically, though, they also pick up faces, pedestrians, the details of what you're wearing. The cameras are detailed enough to see what's on people's phones if you're at the right angle. And once all of this data is uploaded to their cloud, all of it is searchable by any law enforcement officer from any department anywhere in the country. This is how Texas police ended up searching 83,000 Flock cameras to investigate a woman for a suspected abortion. Ultimately, the Texas police tried to charge this woman unsuccessfully with murder, based on surveillance data. For more details on that, check out the Electronic Frontier Foundation story linked in sources for this week, because it's quite a doozy of a story. These are what Flock cameras look like, or two common examples of them. The kind on the right is the kind that you'll see a lot. That's like the classic example of the automatic license plate reader, and there's a bunch of those on the west side of town. And then this sort of, also they use AI. All of this stuff is connected, and that's why we're all covering all of it in 1 week. So here's from Flock's website, deploy AI-powered video where it matters most. No blind spots, no hassle, and fully integrated into Flock. And yeah, that's the kind of camera that is put on one of the light posts on Kirkwood. So if you look up at those by the library, you'll see one of those. Moving on. Long-term nuclear waste. I promised to mention this back in week 1, and I keep my promises. It's also a fascinating example of futurism in action. Ecological threat here is, well, radiation for hundreds of thousands of years is pretty bad for the environment. The military angle here is pretty apparent, right? Long-term nuclear waste in the US is primarily from military research and testing and weapons development. And then sociopolitically, got a lot of questions, right? Some of which we talked about earlier in this week's content, right? where do the waste facilities go? Where do the testing sites go? It's usually a colonial and an environmentally racist project. Native lands are especially targeted. Um, there's also the socio-political concern of escalating nuclear tensions, and the concern of when we talk about long-term nuclear waste storage, there's a lot of concern about future human generations. Like, how are we going to keep people 10,000 years from now from exploring this abandoned long-term nuclear waste facility? We want to make sure that people know not to go there and not to dig there. But that concern often goes alongside ignoring the needs of present communities living near these sites because, well, they know about the radiation. So as long as they know about it, it's not a concern. When it's like, no, it's still a concern to be living next to a nuclear waste repository. So this is worth contrasting with the principle of seven generations, because this is a very different approach, right? It's still concerned about what happens in the future, many generations into the future, but only with respect to how do we keep people from digging up this radioactive waste, not in terms of making it so they don't have to deal with radioactive waste to begin with, right? And it's also not particularly concerned with the generations preceding. As long as they don't dig here, it's fine if we put it on native land. Is kind of that's the irony here. And that's worth talking about. But also, yeah, there is this really interesting futurist question here of how do you communicate a warning that far into the future, especially when it's something as hard to explain as, oh, there's radioactive waste here and it could give you cancer if you were exposed to it for long enough. There were actually like a bunch of basically like think tank type gatherings where people came together, philosophers, engineers, architects, artists, people from all different sort of like fields of study and work came together to try and problem solve this. Like, how do we develop a warning system that is as universal as possible, that we can transmit through time? People came up with some crazy shit. There are some really cool examples of this. These are all real ones. The Atomic Priesthood, which would be a cult of secret knowledge and legends. That would be like you could join the priesthood and then you'd be given like the ancient texts about like nuclear threats and nuclear radiation and what to do to prevent people from getting exposed. And then that would like the secrecy of it and like our fascination as humans with secret societies and things might keep us motivated in like passing down this information. It might like keep the importance of it alive. Right. And religions and their artifacts tend to be the kinds of things that we preserve. So maybe this would manage to like put it into the category of things that future civilizations would think, oh, this is very important to these people for reasons. My personal favorite example is the idea of the Ray cat, which is a theoretical project of breeding cats so they start changing color in the presence of dangerous levels of radiation. So basically turn cats into visual Geiger counters. And then this only works or even makes sense if you do it in conjunction with spreading a myth about like a repeated myth and image of associating cats changing color with extreme life-threatening danger. And there's images of the Ray cats, the name Ray cats as being like a catchy descriptor for this. And then the idea would be like to create a sort of folklore of, if your cat changes color, you need to leave. If your cat changes color, you're going to die. Some people wrote songs about it. The idea is like if you make a really, really horrifically catchy song about cats changing color being really bad, then it'll get stuck in people's heads. And then scary architecture to keep people away is a big one. So here's one example of that scary architecture. This is a one proposed site marker for the waste isolation pilot plant, which is that's North America's like currently in use radioactive waste dumping ground. And it's in New Mexico. And yeah, they proposed these giant spikes And ultimately, what people settled on was like giant 25-foot granite pillars, and then like 7 layers of like barriers, like cement, I think barriers, like really thick ones, with messages in 7 different languages telling people to not go in. Um, and the text used um, is what's quoted here. This is actually just from the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant's own website. So this is the long-term nuclear warning text. This place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing valued is here. This place is a message and part of a system of messages. Pay attention to it. Sending this message was very important to us. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. So the idea is like, this is not treasure. This is not a tomb. This is not a place that you should be poking around. Nothing good is here. And it's just interesting language given that it's stolen land. And to turn it into a place not of honor and not to be valued is quite loaded when you've made it uninhabitable due to radioactive decay for hundreds of thousands of years. Moving on to the last topic for us today, space colonialism. It's very common to hear the term space colonialism thrown out without a lot of consideration for like the actual meaning of what that looks like and the colonialism of it all. So let's talk about that a bit. The idea of a Mars colony has been a fixture and a dream for many space agencies and private companies for decades, as well as to science fiction authors. Because it's cool, the idea of going to live on another planet. And Mars is right there, right? And as far as we can tell, there's not intelligent life there right now. There may have been at some point. And they've found life there. It's just, bacterial. So it's different. It's the thought. So perhaps the relative emptiness of Mars is why when we talk about space colonies, we don't usually address the colonialism of it when we talk about the real Mars anyway, although we definitely talk about it in fiction, and that's why we assign so much fiction. Also because it's good short stories that are worth reading. Anyway, ecological aspects of this. Space colonialism has been used as a rhetorical tool to avoid discussing and addressing climate crisis concerns here on Earth, right? If we focus tech and money and our belief, like if we're committed to the idea that we can colonize Mars, then we don't really need to worry about solving anthropogenic climate change, right? Because we will prevent it from happening in our climate-controlled Mars colony. So we can just focus our tech and our money and our research on ways off of this planet rather than cutting the industries we know to be worsening conditions. That's just one possible read here, right? Space colonialism is definitely a militaristic prospect in a lot of ways, both because a lot of space programs are caught up in national governmental policies and goals. Right, a lot of the tech used in space travel is dual-use tech, which means it's got civilian and military applications. Right, a lot of satellites have military and surveillance roles. Actually, it's not in sources because this just came, I just remembered this right now, but the source, my source for this is the podcast, Well, There's Your Problem, which is a podcast about engineering disasters. And they have a whole episode about the Titan missiles, which were our go-to nuclear missiles for quite a large chunk of the 20th century when we had massive missiles. Anyway, these are no longer our go-to nuclear missiles, but unused ones, like ones that don't have nuclear warheads equipped to them or didn't, were used as rockets instead, because a missile is like a rocket is just a missile that isn't being used as a weapon, but is instead being used as a transport device. But it's the same skeleton. It's the same mechanism. It's just the payload is not an explosive or a nuclear device. It is people going to space with science equipment. So all that is to say, the military is very caught up in the space industry and vice versa. Also, a lot of missiles rely on satellites. Um, satellite order. I meant for orders. Sorry for the typo. Missiles. A lot of missiles rely on satellites for orders for telling them like where to go and when to go. Um, GPS also relies on satellites and sends out military codes as well. It's kind of like a more futuristic numbers station, which is radio stations, some of which still exist, where you can just hear a bunch of numbers and it's broadcast code because it's code that wouldn't be parsable unless you are in the know. That's just a cool fun fact. Sociopolitically, space colonialism raises lots of questions, right? Who goes to space? Does everyone get the chance? Do people get to choose if they want to go? The capacity of early space colonies would likely be quite limited. So, what criteria are used to determine who stays and who goes? Who does the deciding? What's the context, right? Because that depends. Are people going to necessarily like die soon if they don't make it into a space colony? Depends on when we're opening a space colony and why. So let's talk about space travel versus space colonialism. What's the difference? It's a rectangle square kind of situation, right? If you're doing space colonialism, you're traveling to and through space. The question becomes kind of like, are you terraforming? And if so, how and why? Because terraforming can mean different things, right? Terraforming is a word meaning like what happens when you take a world and turn it into someplace inhabitable to Earth life. Um, Change its form to be more like Terra, Earth. Um, the question is, are you doing that to survive? Or are you doing that to erase whatever was there previously? Are you trying to make life adaptable? Or are you trying to make Earth 2.0? And these are just interesting questions to keep in mind, right? I don't have answers for these. These are just important questions to have in mind when you're thinking about space travel and what is motivating it? Why are people going to space? Are they being forced to? And when they get to other worlds, are they changing them only as much as they need to survive there? Or are they erasing what is there and remaking it? Like, how much are we willing to engage with other worlds as such versus just trying to make a space colony? And is space colonialism fueled by colonialism on Earth? And that's the biggest question here, right? Because why are we going to space in the first place? A lot of environmental degradation that we see these days is done by colonial governments and colonial, like the industries of colonial states, often in spite of resistance by indigenous nations, right? We see this across the Americas. A lot of indigenous land defenders and forest defenders are murdered in South America for trying to protect community water supplies, protect the rainforest, things like that. And in Canada, we've got the prosecution and criminalization of anti-pipeline activists. In Turtle Island, yeah, we've got Canada's part of Turtle Island. What am I talking about? Here, we have the same thing happening in the U.S. as well, and our continued destruction of the earth in spite of Indigenous land and water defense, right? Like that is colonialism fueling climate change, which in turn is used to justify investment into proposals for space colonialism. And also the idea of who gets to go and why. raises some interesting questions there too, because a lot of settler colonies are people fleeing some kind of persecution, right? The US was a safe haven in its early colonial era for Protestants who were being persecuted for their Protestantism in Europe. Australia was a penal colony for European criminals. Um, if we send a colony to Mars, it will likely be fleeing ecological degradation here. But it'll also be likely relatively well off people who can afford to leave in such a condition, unless we send people who can't afford it necessarily. Like there's different ways this could go. It could be a high price privilege to go join a space colony, or it could be something where the risk is so great that the most marginalized people are the likeliest to be sent first. Either way, there's some interesting connections to upland on land. So let's talk about some various fictional representations of space travel and how space is conceptualized as a way forward for people who presumably are living in struggling Earth societies. In Butler, right, in Parable of the Sower, we've got space as a kind of heaven, right? We've got this meditation on this dead astronaut who never got to go to heaven, and how, like, it's so sad that she died on the way to space because space is heaven to Lauren, right? Earthseed's destiny is to take root amongst the stars as this, like, realization of what heaven could be materially, as an escape from the threats of a dystopian world where there's so much scarcity of resources and so much suffering and death. On the other hand, Ray Bradbury is making a much more explicit portrayal of, right, whether or not what Lauren is describing meets the definition of space colonialism is like an interesting question that warrants discussion, because we don't really get enough to answer that question in Parable of the Sower. So just an interesting thing to think about, because you could make a case in both directions. On the other hand, Ray Bradbury in And the Moon Was Still as Bright is very explicitly drawing connections between this Mars mission and colonial contact with the Americas and its after effects and its rhetoric. These parallels are an explicit critique here, right? It's not a coincidence that Bradbury is writing it this way. He is making statements about the founding of the Americas. And a lot of them really, really resonate with the US. Not exclusively, right? These connections are broader than that, but they do resonate with US history from the early colonial period through the time of the Indian Wars. And also, like, a lot of this is still happening today, right? There's a lot that resonates in this story with the real history of colonialism in the West. So it's extremely, we've got one perspective, we've got a bunch of different perspectives that are voicing different aspects of and critiquing different aspects of US colonial history, right? So we've got this extremely early colonial approach to how illness is a weapon of genocide, whether intentionally or not, right? In this story, we've got Hathaway explaining mass chickenpox deaths, and they acknowledge that this happened accidentally and without knowledge, right? But it still calls back to a real phenomenon, which is where when Western colonists came to the Americas, they brought all kinds of diseases that people did not have generational exposure and immunity to, which meant that after colonial contact, indigenous people across the Americas started dying rapidly of things like tuberculosis and smallpox. Now, originally, this is unintentional, but when colonial military forces saw how effective smallpox was at wiping out large proportions of communities, they saw it as a potential weapon and actually gave smallpox covered blankets to indigenous people, to like messengers who came to one of their forts and caused an outbreak of smallpox purposefully as a weapon, like as a bioweapon. Now that's not that kind of purposeful thing doesn't happen in this story, but Hathaway's use of like phrasing is still pretty significant for like how the mass chickenpox deaths in Martian cities in this story are framed as a boon to the colonial project, right? Hathaway says, chances are a few of the Martians, if they were smart, escaped to the mountains, but there aren't enough Yumani who be a native problem this planet is through. The phrasing of native problem is really significant because it's very reminiscent of US governmental figures' rhetoric during the Indian Wars. And also just kind of during like the period of the founding of the country. Right? Former President Thomas Jefferson described Native people as merciless Indian savages. That's a quote. And that kind of rhetoric shapes US policy throughout the like founding of the country, the Indian Wars, and the expansion westward and the closure of the frontier. That whole period is inundated with this kind of rhetoric, and also with the idea that mass death is a good thing for the colonial regime. Just like here on Mars, the fact that there's nobody alive in these Martian cities opens up Mars to occupation. And that's exactly what happens, right? We see a colonial occupation. The majority of the mission party celebrates their arrival to Mars by partying, littering, and assigning names to places they discovered that already had names, presumably, like Biggs Canal. And Spender, the figure of Spender, has a lot of guilt over his role in this, but he still came on the mission, right? He gets very self-blame, like blames himself and blames everybody and is very angry, but he's still here. He's uncomfortable with the situation, but still participating, and he presumably doesn't have to be. So Spender says, ask me then if I believe in the spirit of things as they were used, and I'll say yes. They're all here, all the things that had uses, all the mountains which had names, and we'll never be able to use them without feeling uncomfortable. And somehow the mountains will never sound right to us. We'll give them new names, but the old names are there, somewhere in time, and the mountains were shaped and seen under those names. The names we'll give to the canals and mountains and cities will fall like so much butter on the back of a mallard. No matter how we touch Mars, we'll never touch it. And then we'll get mad at it, and you know what we'll do? We'll rip it up, rip the skin off, and change it to fit ourselves. And these are two kinds of terraforming, right? Renaming a thing and trying to engage with it, knowing that it has a history that you'll never understand and never be able to access, or taking control over it and turning it into something else for yourself. And the violence of that is significant, right? And the captain's rhetoric is also really important to talk about because it is a great example of the trope of the quote-unquote noble savage and the myth of the quote-unquote vanishing Indian. So the captain says, from the look of their cities, they were a graceful, beautiful, and philosophical people. They accepted what came to them. They acceded to racial death, that much we know, and without a last-moment war of frustration to tumble down their cities. Every town we've seen so far has been flawlessly intact. This is extremely similar to the rhetoric of the Marshall Decision that we discussed a few weeks back, right? The rhetoric of how indigenous people ought to like disappear like fallen leaves, like just this incredibly problematic rhetoric of a passive dying away that is completely devoid of the context wherein people aren't passively dying, people are being killed, whether by exposure to the germs of an invading force or through more overt targeted attacks. Um, but here, the captain frames this as an entirely passive acceptance of racial death, which is very significant because they could have just used any word. They could have used extinction, but racial death calls to mind real world phenomena. Like, not that extinction isn't a real world phenomena, but it gets us into the headspace of thinking about what we call it when a people disappears like this. We do not call it disappearing, right? We call it genocide. Um, and then moving on to the Kurosato story, which is going to be our last source for the class. This is another very interesting story that opens up a lot of like uncertainty and nuance around what it means to travel through space, right? Space is a site of transit that can look very different to different people in this story. It can be a way in which colonialism propagates racism, caste systems, and exploitation by controlling who gets to go to space, right? Via this border between citizen and non-citizen, human and non-human, and this like blood quantum type fixation on identifying people through their genes. I don't remember if we've talked about blood quantum in this class. I'm sure we talked about it a little bit. It's this idea that who counts as indigenous, like who counts formally, um, for some Native nations is determined by this thing called blood quantum, which is like how much traceable blood relation do you have to like people who are recognized as citizens of this nation from like usually some roll of names from like a particular era. It depends on the nation, and then beyond, but like below a certain fraction of blood quantum, people aren't eligible for formal citizenship. Um, blood quantum significantly was not a thing before colonial contact because there was no reason to be tracking this kind of thing. So this is a colonial. This is a sequela of colonialism, um, and so it's very interesting that that is kind of like the rhetoric being used in this story, in this of this like oppressive state system. Um, but at the same time, these seed ships, at least the Star River Tribe seed ship, seems very different from the violent, exclusive, expropriative society or exploitative society that the android Anji lives in, right? Anji Iron Woman is two people in the story. There's this terminally ill woman who is going to die. And then there is this android who wants to live. Not as an android enslaved by this society, but as a person. Um, and who, through some kind of arrangement, like Anji terminally ill wants to die, get it over with. Anji android wants to live. They swap, right? Anji, the human woman, dies. Anji, the android, takes her place and then gets on the ship. And is recognized by Star River Tribe as being a different Anji Iron Woman than the Anji Iron Woman they used to know. But they do not ostracize her and they do not judge her for this. Instead, they acknowledge that just like the earth that they have in their soil is not the same as their traditional homelands, and the way that they're living on this spaceship is not the way that they would in the past, they can still live in relation, right? They still live in a relationship with the buffalo. They still live in a relationship with the stars, and they can still live in relationship with each other, regardless of whether each other means human or android. Um, And so we get this really interesting world wherein these seed ships are a primary means by which humans are privileged over androids. And we have all kinds of terraforming talk and like the continuance of this very controlling, bigoted social structure. But you also have at least some seed ships that play this really interesting role where they are taking space travel as a site for indigenous resurgence and taking the opportunity to terraform as a means of reforming Terra, not reforming another world into Terra, but reforming Terra into something they can take with them to another world and live by keeping to the old ways but adapting them to new worlds. And that's what these quotes are about. These quotes towards the end of the story. And perhaps this is why Anji, Iron Woman, as this new version, can still be part of this family and can find in this tribe and on this ship a safe place away from the kinds of violence that she used to experience. Because this ship in particular is doing something a little bit different with its approach to journeying out into the stars and trying to start a new life in a new world. Thank you guys for an awesome summer session. I really look forward to reading your final papers. Please let me know if you need anything while you're students at IU or in general. I'm not super sure what I could do for you other than give you book recommendations and read essays and give you comments on them, but I'm happy to do both of those things. And if you liked the material for this class, check out the other classes offered in American Studies. And yeah, don't be a stranger. Good luck with your finals. You're gonna crush them. Let me know if you need anything. Here are our sources. Yep. Bye.